story developing in the last hour. The Electoral Commission says it was trying to uphold free and fair elections when it allowed the reopening of candidate lists for the local government polls. This is an answering affidavit to the application by the DA, which wants that process closed, or rather not reopened. Our senior political reporter, Ziyanda Ngcobo, joins us now. Ziyanda, good afternoon to you. Okay, I've got to go back in my own timeline here. So we have the Constitutional Court ruling saying the elections must go ahead by the 1st of November. They're going ahead. Voter registration must open. The IEC interpreted that to mean that the candidate registration process must reopen. The DA says no. What does the Electoral Commission say in response?
So the IEC is saying, well, the Constitutional Court order did not actually strip them of their statutory powers. In other words, the powers that are given to them by the Municipal Electoral Act. And they're arguing that, well, actually, you cannot actually now jump the sequence of an election timetable. And according to the Municipal Electoral Act, you first have a voter registration drive and then a candidate nominations list process, which they say, because the voter registration process was reopened as a result of the Constitutional Court order, the same must follow then with the candidate nominations list. They've also slammed the DA's applications as premature and speculative. You'll recall that the DA has actually argued that this interpretation of the IEC's interpretation, I should say, of the Constitutional Court order is in favor of the ANC, and that it will largely benefit them. However, you know, the affidavit was deposed in Simon Mabolo's name, the CEO. They're basically saying, one, you actually don't even have evidence to prove that there would be any prejudice if this process is reopened, because it won't just open for the ANC, it will open for all the political parties. And secondly, when you look then at the timetable, that they're empowered to do so, but that the DA, they say, has no right to actually bring the Constitutional Court into what they say is actually a political matter, and it's a matter of differences in the middle of an electoral process. If you have a problem, go to the courts once the elections are done and dusted.
I mean, what this really gets down to is, you know, how important the technical stuff is here, because the stakes are really, really high. I mean, control of metros is at stake.
Certainly, and if you look at the parties that are opposing it, it's actually the larger political parties, Stephen, that are opposing the reopening of the candidate nominations process, because they stand a lot to benefit. I mean, for an example, you will recall that the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal had a briefing to say that they would have at least 5 wards that they wouldn't be able to contest in Opongola, Abakulusi, Edumbe, and so on. And these areas are largely in the northern KwaZulu-Natal region, where the IFP largely operates. They are opposing this application. The DA, the IFP, the EFF, as well as Action SA, are opposed to the reopening of the nominations list process. And the IEC, even in its papers, even though they say that it's not the decision of the liaison parties or process that sits, the committee, I should say, they're saying most of the political parties have supported them. UDM, Good, AIC, and so on. At least 10 political parties supported the reopening of this process. So again, they're arguing that actually, if you have such a big problem, prove, first of all, that there'd be prejudice, but secondly, we are allowed to, by law, to actually reopen the nominations process.
And I mean, when you have, I think it's the Freedom Front Plus also supporting the ANC, also supporting the Electoral Commission, when you have the Freedom Front Plus and the ANC in the same WhatsApp group, well, that will probably strengthen your case in some ways.
Certainly. I mean, the ANC has already described, you know, the application by the DA as basically being irrational. And they, of course, have a responsibility to come out and dismiss then these claims that, firstly, remember, they pulled out of their Concord application to actually reopen the process, and there were rumors that in fact this may have been as a result of them knowing the outcomes of the Constitutional Court judgment. And so this, of course, then speaks to the issues that has been plaguing the judiciary, that they consistently get dragged into political matters. And this is actually part of the argument that the IEC is making, that actually the Constitutional Court doesn't have to make a determination on this. Yes, they made an order, but the order ultimately also restores the powers that we already have, and they did not say that we cannot reopen the candidate list process. But also, another issue of contention here, Stephen, is the words reasonably necessary, which is what was in the court order. The IEC, I should say, is saying it was reasonably necessary to reopen the process if you follow the sequence of an election timetable, whereas the DA as well as the EFF and IFP are arguing the opposite.
I don't want to put any more pressure on the Constitutional Court than is reasonably possibly necessary, but you've got the DA lodging an application, you've got the Electoral Commission responding, I'm sure the ANC and the others will be part of it, but they're responding without actually having the full knowledge of the reasons behind the Constitutional Court's original judgment that the elections must go ahead. Now, the reason I don't want to put too much pressure on the Constitutional Court is that their decisions are precedent-setting.
Yes.
So you don't want them to get, to miswrite something.
Yes.
You've got to be quite careful about putting too much pressure on them. But it does show you how complex this is. How do you fight a court case when you don't have the reasons for the previous judgment, which is utterly, let me use the legal word, germane to what you're fighting about?
I think that's also certainly adding to the complexity, Stephen, that they don't have the reasons for why the Constitution reached the decision that it did, but ultimately it's binding on everyone. And I think that's where the IEC is coming from, that reasonably necessary is something that is open to interpretation for all. So you cannot actually come and tell us, as the statutory body of this electoral process that needs to get underway and that actually is being guided by the law. There are laws, the Municipal Electoral Act, the Municipal Systems Act, and so why do you have to take it back to the Concord? Why are you second-guessing? In fact, that's another thing that came out in the papers, that the DA does not have a right to second-guess the decisions of the IEC. You can see in that wording that the IEC is also now almost hitting back at the credibility jabs that the political parties have taken as a result of this unprecedented time that we found ourselves in. Of course, having an election during COVID-19, during a pandemic, which has never happened before, the campaign trails having to be shortened, but also not happening in the way that they usually do, with door-to-doors, etc. So the IEC starts off its papers by saying that this is a politically difficult situation, but ultimately the courts don't need to be involved in this, and actually as the IEC we should be trusted to do this.
It's not going to be the last court case between now and the 1st of November, is it? I wouldn't even be surprised if there's one or two after.
Certainly. I mean, we know that the EFF and IFP have already filed their answering papers. Then we're going to get, what the Concord actually says, and if it's not ruled in some of the parties' favors, maybe we'll see then after the elections there will be a fight, not a Concord battle, I shouldn't say that, but a court challenge that is brought before the country's courts, because the issue here is about freeness and fairness, which the IEC says they need to also attend to, and this is why then they've reopened this nominations process.
Ziyanda and Ngcobo, I would say ipso pergo proctor hoc or something, but I don't even know what that means in Latin, but I think we're all going to know by the end of it. Ziyanda and Ngcobo, thanks very much indeed.